All right. Good morning, everyone. If you're just joining, welcome. We're going to get started with our webinar in just about a minute or two and wait for folks to jump in the meeting. We've got a good number of folks, but it looks like, there's still folks jumping in. So hang tight and we will kick things off shortly. And again, if you're just jumping in, welcome. We're going to hang tight for a moment and let some stragglers jump into the meeting. We will start shortly. All right, and I'm just looking at the participants count. Looks like things have stabilized. I think most everybody has joined at this point, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody for joining our webinar this morning. My name's Paul Smith. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Kuali. I'll be hiding in the background, fielding your questions and moderating as needed. Excited for today's webinar, excited to have you join us. Today's webinar titled From Months to Minutes, UC San Diego's Digital Transformation with Kuali Build. We're super excited to have Kevin Chou. He is let me advance my slide. One moment. There we go. Oh, a few housekeeping items first. Yep, let me get into this. The session is being recorded, so we can make that recording available to you afterwards if needed. All attendees will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. And if you have questions during the webinar, please post those in chat. I'll be fielding those, handing those off to Joel and Kevin as they come in. And there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of the webinar as well. And now I'm excited to introduce Kevin Chou. He's the Deputy CIO and Interim Chief Information Security Officer at the University of California at San Diego. And with us today also is our CEO, Joel Dehlin, CEO of Kuali. And with that, Joel, I'll hand things off to you and Kevin.
Great, Kevin. Thank you, Paul. Kevin, thanks so much for being here. I've been waiting to tell this story for a long time, and you tell it so well. So just thanks for being willing to join us. How do you want to start off?
I got like 2 slides, right?
Okay.
I think maybe I'll use that to just sort of tell the story. And, as with things that are very conversational, feel free to interrupt. We'll do questions. We'll keep it informal. And we'll just kind of make the most out of our time together.
That sounds great.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and get us going here. All right. Just want to make sure you can see my screen, Joel.
Yep.
Awesome. So thanks for having me. My name is Kevin Chou. Of course, I'm the Deputy CIO here at UC San Diego. So I'm responsible for all of the enterprise applications, business and administrative systems here at UCSD. And I drew the short straw. And so I am the interim CISO for another couple of months, hopefully not much longer. I'm going to go ahead and jump in here. Really, it's a bit of a wall of text, but I think it's important to really start with some interesting use cases. And it also gives me an opportunity to tell a bit of a story. UC San Diego was an early adopter of Kuali Build back even before, 2020, I'd say probably in the 2019 timeframe. And as an early adopter, we were very excited about the vision that Joel and the team at Kuali had set forth for Build. We had an inkling of what we were going to do with it, but we weren't really sure. We had the software already. We were playing around with it. We were doing all sorts of interesting proof of concepts. And then all of a sudden, this thing called the pandemic hit. And so I was literally 3 days after the state shutdown here at California. It was probably around March of 2020. And 3 days in, we were told that all of the lab materials for folks doing research on campus will cease to exist if we don't allow essential workers back into the labs to take care of their lab materials, their animals, and all sorts of stuff. And so we were working with a bunch of paper forms that had been schlepped around by the county, by the state, and by the feds. And we were told, okay, we just need to have a process. This process can't be etched in stone. This process needs to be super flexible. And we're probably going to change it 100 times in the next 3 weeks. And so I dug into our tool chest of Google Forms, of Qualtrics, DocuSign. We looked at ServiceNow. We looked at our ERPs, and really nothing quite gets us the flexibility, the speed, and the capabilities, even at that time, long before Kuali Build's long list of features that were since released. And so we built out our first production Kuali Build form to support return to research. And in about, I would say, probably 3 hours, we came up with a prototype. We quickly circulated that with campus leadership. And within, I would say, probably 3-4 days, we were launching this form to thousands of faculty members all over UC San Diego. So really, that's kind of the trial by fire. It was not quite as structured and as planned of a rollout, but because we had been playing around with it, we knew how it worked, we knew what it was capable of. We decided that this was the time to really give it a whirl. So I was actually the builder, believe it or not, and so I know intimately how that form was put together. And to this day, we still maintain thousands of forms, documents that have been routed for approval and approved. We don't use it anymore, obviously, at this stage, but it is something of an interesting way to start. Now, several of these other ones here, I'll just quickly touch on, really shows the variety of the types of uses of Kuali Build. And it's just a very small sampling. And I'll get into the Kuali Build by numbers to give a sense of the size and scale of what we've done here. International remote work, that was a prime example where collaboration between multiple central offices got together and decided that we're all going to ditch our forms because it made no sense for a PI, a student, or a staff member to go to every single one of these offices to get a paper form signed. And they are all different, and they were all routed differently, and there was no visibility into any of it while it was traversing through the workflow. And so this is a good one of showing how the collaboration really cuts across everywhere, right? IT, export control, sponsor project offices, and even HR to create one single process to really streamline things at UCSD.
Kevin, just a quick question about this one.
Yeah, please.
So there are a lot of people on this webinar, and there's a mix of people from IT, from research departments, from provost offices. So there's kind of a mix of people. Where did this idea come from? And do you have any advice, and maybe you're going to talk about this later, advice on this kind of collaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of giving a bit of a preview of how we decided to deploy Kuali Build. We saw Kuali Build as a tool that was not limited to IT use. Now, there's a couple of use cases here that really talks about how IT has put it to use, but really the power of Kuali Build is how accessible it is. And so the way we tackled the implementation of Kuali Build, and we'll talk about staffing and resourcing it in the next slide, really focused around process improvement. And what I mean by process improvement is it's not about taking a paper process and put it into Kuali Build and be done, right? And all done. It really is about, okay, let's get together. Let's improve the business process let's come up with the most leanest, meanest process that we can come up with. And that is actually what we put into Kuali Build. And so all of our requests for new apps does come through our team. Our team will then assign, depending on if this is a frequent flyer or if this is a new passenger, we will then assign someone who's Lean Six Sigma certified, usually at a green belt or a black belt level, to actually work with that individual in their office to help with process improvement. We then build the app about 85% of the way there. And then we use that as the training mechanism to help folks get acclimated with the tool and what it's capable of. We find that helping people start with the scaffolding is much easier because they can fill in the 15%. But if you say, hey, I'm going to train you very generically, and then you're on your way with a blank sheet of paper, usually 3 weeks later, they still have a blank sheet of paper.
That's a quote. That's great.
All right. So a couple of other interesting use cases just to kind of throw out there. Of course, the collaboration, the process improvement really has to stem from these offices. Sometimes it's just the current state is just that terrible. Sometimes it's because, folks were already having conversations and they're trying to find a tool. And of course, we from Central IT does offer Kuali Build as a service, in addition to a number of other workflow and form builders, depending on the use cases. Academic personnel. I think this is an interesting one to show because all of their applications are faculty facing. And so for those of you out there that are like, well, is it intuitive? Is it useful? Will people know how to use it? Do they need a lot of training? Well, I can tell you our faculty does not show up to training. I don't know about yours, but it's hard. They're busy. They got way better things to do. So anything that's faculty facing, we stand by sort of the philosophy that it should require little to no training. And if it requires training, hopefully it's compliance. Otherwise, we try not to go there. And so everything from return to active duty, administrative appointments, salary agreements, all sorts of faculty facing applications, we do have a very large adoption in sort of that population. We have a thing called a PI exception request, which may be unique to San Diego or at least California, but basically the gist of it is our PIs are not allowed to be PIs on a grant proposal unless they fit within a certain job code or they have an exception. Now, Kuali has a sponsor programs product, which we're also a user of. But what we found is that for the faculty member, Kuali Build is far more intuitive. So what we do is we actually allow our principal investigators or their staff to go through an exception process and have that draw information from Kuali research to auto-populate a lot of information about their proposals. And then once the approval has been obtained, to push that approval back into Kuali research. So really kind of a two-way integration, leveraging both the GraphQL input as well as the API output. And of course, pulling in data from our HCM, which is PeopleSoft based. One of the most technical use cases that we had was the degree plan change approval process, which actually initiates from our SIS, our student information system, which is homegrown. It uses GraphQL to actually push content into Kuali Build as a document and fires off the workflow. Once the workflow completes, the API writes back. So the PI exception is sort of a form. We're still using Kuali Build as the form. For the SIS and the degree plan change, it's actually all the data is from the SIS already. So there is no user interface. We're using it as a general purpose workflow engine. And so I would say that's probably one of the more technical use cases where I would say, you probably need IT, but most, if not all of these other ones do not require IT to do. And we'll talk a little bit about where IT then comes in beyond the process improvement. Two remaining ones here. The first one really goes to show that we're using this with external partners as well, not just UC San Diego employees. So we do very liberally use the anonymous user function to allow participants to be outside of UC San Diego. And then last but not least, the UAW collective bargaining resulted in some financial impact with rates changing, of course, salary for our graduate student and our research scholars. And basically what we did was, again, it's like the COVID one, right? The collective bargaining gets signed and it says, okay, now we have an issue. because we're going to have a bunch of researchers that's going to likely have a financial shortfall because their proposals were approved at a certain rate. And now we need to give everybody raises, right? And so that process is another prime example where we got to get something out. It's got to be rapid, it's got to be flexible, and it's got to be able to draw upon the other enterprise applications that we already have in place. Okay. So anyway, so these are just kind of a sampling of the different types of use cases. I wanted to just pause here, Joel, and see if you have any like questions or anything interesting about these particular use cases before I move on.
I have so many questions about these, but I also know that you're going to summarize some of the things that I'm going to ask questions on. So let's go to the rest of the slides first, and then I may come back and ask you.
All right, sounds good. So here's a high level Kuali Build by the numbers at UC San Diego. We now have a total of over 400 applications, 419 as of Friday of last week. We have new applications being launched or at least being created. Within the last 30 days alone, we've had 19. We have now exceeded 65,000 individual documents. So these are actual documents that have been submitted through one or more Kuali Build applications. And just within the last 30 days, 4,300 documents. So the adoption here is quite broad and very current. Now, I talked about this a little bit earlier about what does IT do, right? So we have a staff member at 50%. He is the service owner for the service offering that is Kuali Build. And we have 2 part-time student workers on that team. The 3 of them essentially serve as the front door for helping with some of the training, some of the process improvement, as well as some of the Q&A. They're also the ones that will, go out and nag people. Hey, your application's been, in development for some time now. We've noticed it hasn't been published. Do you need help? Right, so proactive outreach. They also help community manage our builders of north of 30 unique builders that are spread out across the university, most of which are not in IT. And the last but not least, one of the biggest sort of work that IT had to do was, besides getting Kuali Build integrated with single sign-on, which took no time, was to get APIs published. Right. So a lot of these forms, if all you're doing is data entry, workflow, you're good. But what happens if you want to bring in information? And that's what we found. A lot of our use cases is because we want the ability to take enterprise hierarchies and data into these forms, both for aligning for reporting purposes, as well as to just ease the data entry burden, like the UAW application, for example. And so we added APIs to Kuali Build through its built-in functionality, but leveraging our API manager to essentially make data available to drop-down menus, to free-form fields, as well as for workflow purposes and for API calls. Now, how does that work? What's included? The most obvious ones are always going to be the hierarchies, right? People hierarchy, reports to, departmental hierarchy, right? How does the department lay out? Financial hierarchy, so your chart of accounts, financial unit, your account codes, anything that are sort of aligned with some sort of master data management. Those are the types of data we want to make available from the systems of record into Kuali Build as an API. And of course, in many cases, we do want the APIs to drop information back into the application. And so those APIs are, of course, part of those 81. We started with 0. We quickly realized that is not going to be adequate. And so while Kuali was modifying and improving the system functionality, we were busy cranking out APIs. And so that really kind of fills out, the distinction between what IT does in offering the service versus, what we would have to do if we had to build all of these applications either from scratch or via, much higher barrier of entry by configuring them into other products.
So for those who are not aware, and the questions have already started coming in, so I'm going to pepper these questions in. Some of them I've been answering offline. For those who aren't aware, at a very high level, Kuali Build is a tool that allows a sort of normal person. Some people call them citizen developers, and I don't like that term because it implies that you have to be a developer. Normal people have the ability to go create forms that support their business. And then and the forms can be very, very simple. You can create a form in literally 30 seconds and publish it. Or they can be incredibly complicated, where the form changes and different things appear and disappear, and they have integrations and all kinds of things like that. Then you have the ability, if you want to create a workflow that supports that form. So some kind of approval process. So the form or the documents created from the form go through an approval process that branches or changes based on different things in the form. And then once that's done, you can view all of the results, all the different documents that are resulting. You can view them based on different filters and groups and sorting and whatever to be able to find the documents. Okay, so Kevin, my question for you is, with a tool like that, y'all have obviously taken this to the max. You've created your own APIs. You've done very, very deep integrations. You've got a half of a person just focused on this, and you've got 30 people actively developing forms. I think there have been 8 more apps that have been created since you did this last week. So you've got a lot of people that are building apps really quickly. What about if somebody wanted to use this in a small department and they just want to kind of get started? Or maybe it's a very small IT shop with a small school. Does it scale?
Yeah, so that's I think that's sort of the beauty of it, right? You can take it to the max like what we have, or you can bring it in as a essentially a no-code solution. Right. So you don't have to have APIs for this to work, just like you described. In fact, when we first launched the COVID application, we launched it with no APIs because we had no time to build an API. And so we really took advantage of the conditional formatting, the workflow capability, everything that's built into the Kuali Build system in order to launch that form, which has since had, over 8,000 forms have been submitted from PIs. So, from a scalability perspective, you could definitely use it as is out of the box, all the way to some of the most unique use cases that we have encountered. As far as, how you might do it, the way that we, at UC San Diego, we kind of have, in some cases, too many tools. Right, not enough tools, which is a different problem. When you have too many tools, you tend to have folks gravitate towards whatever tool they're most comfortable with. May not be the best tool, may not be the most secure, may not be the most effective, but it's the one they know. It's the devil they know, right? So one of the biggest things that we had to do was to educate our community on when to use Kuali Build and when not to use Kuali Build. So now at a department level, you're sort of that population, the surface area is much smaller. So you can really go in and start small by building a couple of applications and really trying them out, testing them out. One of the very unique things about Kuali Build is that as a SaaS product and as a tool that is really geared towards non-developers or non-IT person, there's no dev environment. There's no QA environment. There's only one environment, right? And what that does is it takes away a lot of the complexities that you would typically imagine a developer having to go through, right? You have change control, you got code releases, you got environment management, you got to migrate configuration from one environment to the. None of that exists here. It's really intended for folks that are not technical to be able to go in, create a form. Now, I could tell you that even within IT, our business office are liberal users of Kuali Build. And when I say business office, I mean our financial people, our HR people. These are not developers. And over the last couple of years, we've since automated most of the administrative processes within our department without even considering the hundreds of applications that are outside of us.
That's very cool. And what is the response when users use Build? I know, like I went to your conference, and they had a conference. It was an IT focused conference, and there were a bunch of people coming by our booth talking about what they thought about Build. From your perspective, what do people think about using the tool, sort of emotionally?
So emotionally, what's been interesting, and I think the title of this webinar really speaks to that, months to minutes, right? I think the first time I had to show the COVID form, we were in a very, very senior level meeting. We had our vice chancellor of research was in the room, and she had a very minor feedback on wanting to change one of the help text that was on the form. And she said, okay, well, my only feedback was this thing. Everything else seems to be good, but I'll let you guys know. And oh, by the way, could you let the programmers know that I'd like to get this one thing changed so it's more accurate because I got some questions about it. And so I literally screen shared, pulled up the form, made the change, hit the publish button, and said done. And and our vice chancellor of research at that time was like, no, like seriously, like you gotta send it to the programmers. It's okay. And I'm like, no, that was it. And I can tell you that one of the most avid users of Kuali Build, the person who built that UAW relief fund application, was our associate vice chancellor of research. She started right before COVID. So her and I became the first builders, and she is now an avid supporter. I would say that the immediate reaction that I tend to get for people who use this build as a submitter, right, as a document creator, they tend to look at it and they tend to say, okay, well, it's pretty intuitive. And depending on the process and how the form was designed, if you got somebody who's kind of got an eye for UX, it's going to be a bit more, it's going to have better flow. For the folks who see the back end for the first time, that's when it knocks their socks off. Because
you mean back end as the person designing forms?
Exactly. Because most of the time when people see the form, they expect that it was a form built with code. Right. And so when they want to ask for changes, their expectation is, well, it's going to be a couple of months before they fling it back over to me and say, okay, here's the design. Do you approve? Okay, great. We're to go back, into the cave again, come back with another version, and then say, hey, you ready to UAT this thing? Right. Instead, all of that turns into live working meeting in a Zoom call, making those changes. Now, obviously, there's some downsides, right? If you make a change, and the change is fairly significant, it does alter the schema of the form. So if you have old forms and new forms, right, you do have to handle change control. So there are some nuances, right? Obviously it's not magic, but in terms of simplicity, in terms of speed, time to market, I don't see anything quite like it. I can tell you, Joel, that of course, a form with workflow is dime a dozen, right? We're a ServiceNow shop. We have Highland OnBase for document management. Those require developers, right? As much as they say it's low code, the barrier of entry is just so much higher. And so, we did explore early on, before Kuali Build was in our tool chest, how we might be able to provide some of those tools to the campus. ServiceNow, OnBase were off the table almost immediately. DocuSign was a little bit more workable, but it was very constrained towards obviously electronic signatures. And then beyond that, it was Google Forms, which had the best uptick. But of course, using Google Forms or even Microsoft Forms, it does require a bit more technical chops behind the scenes if you want to actually, stitch things up a little bit more complicated.
All right. So this is related to a question that Ted asks us. Can Kevin list those use cases where Kuali is not the preferred workflow engine, and he uses one of the two others he just referenced? Would love to understand whether this decision is a result of a hard limit in Kuali or a more nuanced decision. Thanks.
Awesome question. Yeah, awesome question. So I can say that it's the what's not in scope, right? So what we did at San Diego is we created a decision matrix, which I'm happy to share with the Kuali team if folks here are interested. But basically, it kind of steps them through, what are the types of things you're trying to do, and depending on what you're trying to do, what would be the right tool of choice. As I said earlier, we do have a case management system, a document management system, an electronic signature application. And so really when things stop going into Kuali Build, when does that happen, right? So the first thing that we don't use Kuali Build for is anything that should be part of your ERP, where you need the system of record. It needs to be audited. It needs to join with data that's inherent within an ERP. So for example, we don't use Kuali Build to do our pre-award management. We use Kuali Research. We don't use Kuali Build to manage AP and AR. We use Oracle Financial Cloud. Those are examples where there are certain business processes that are very much slow changing. They're very much, hardened. And those are the types of things that we typically will configure into our ERP instead of using a tool like Kuali Build, which tends to be a lot more flexible. But, that flexibility could hurt you if you're constantly changing it and it's part of your core enterprise business processes. When we have forms and workflow that result in a ticket, something that now requires service level management, case management, workload management, we build those into ServiceNow. Largely because that is our case management tool of choice. It's not because I couldn't have built a Kuali Build form and then call an API and ship the data over to ServiceNow. It doesn't make sense to do that. We just end up putting those into ServiceNow. Another type of use case would be document management. So if the workflow then results in a document that has to go through some sort of preservation, retention, or destruction, there's policies around document types, and these are not just simple electronic records. They're actual physical documents in some cases that have been scanned into the system. We don't use Kuali Build for those. We tend to kind of use the tool that's made for it. So our general rule of thumb is if it ends in an electronic signature, use DocuSign. If it ends in a case, use ServiceNow. And if it ends in a document, use our document management system. Outside of that, pretty much, as you can see, 420 applications and more just in the last couple of days. I would say that we're probably looking at more applications and workflows being built outside of all of those other systems combined than in Kuali Build. And that's largely because of the types of use cases that we see that are better fitting.
I like that way of thinking about it. This Francisco has a related question, so maybe you could just put some color on this.
Sure.
Francisco asked, you mentioned that swift implementation of a form system at the onset of the pandemic, and how after reviewing various tools like ServiceNow and Google Forms, you found Kuali Build to be the most suitable option. Could you please elaborate on what specific features or capabilities of Build made it preferable over the other available options? So why are you using more new forms for Kuali Build than all the others combined?
Yeah, so I think a good way to sort of explain that really, I think the biggest one is time to market, speed. If I need to draft requirements, write spec, and put it into the backlog for our ServiceNow developers to create the form and go through the SDLC, that wouldn't have been done in 3 days. Right, not even 3 weeks. And yes, this even during the pandemic, it would have still taken some time. When we were looking at other solutions that were available, the thing that made Kuali Build very interesting is the flexibility to make changes. When the onset of the pandemic, we were getting forms that were literally paper. Right, from the city, from the county. And we knew, like, the day we looked at that paper was already out of date because the state was still cranking out those iterations. And so we knew we needed something that was highly flexible, very, very fast to market, and would not require us to sort of create barriers on the talent side in order to be able to do the work. So the tools that naturally resonated to us was, of course, Kuali Build we talked about, Google Forms, Microsoft Forms, which require some expertise in, say, SharePoint and SharePoint development capability and knowledge. We even looked at, well, what if we were to just create a shared drive, have people manually fill out these PDF forms and drop it into these folders just as a way of like using a folder hierarchy, right? To manually create a workflow. And what we found is that, yeah, you know what, we could have probably made that work, and that may have been less risk than taking, the leap of faith into an application for the first time, using it for COVID response. What we found, though, is that then we lose all reporting capability. Right. And so, what about the individual names, within these documents themselves? What if we wanted to know what building they're in? What if we wanted to know, there was somebody who tested positive and we needed to notify everybody within that building? We wouldn't be able to do that if we had to sift through all of the individual PDF documents. Exactly. Yeah. And so, naturally, PDF, which was one of the solutions that we had looked into, DocuSign, some of the Google form would have been a little bit easier. If we were able to build out the workflow in Google Forms, it naturally ends up in a sheet. So it could be a little bit easier to process. But as far as, the sort of what we had available to us, how quickly we needed to get done, and how much change we were expecting. The fact that we also needed to analyze the data, I think Kuali Build just kind of jumped out at us. Our alternative, and I even hate to say this now, is PDF forms drop in folders. We had that as our backup plan. And so had Kuali Build not been able to be used, we were ready to go that option.
One of the high level strategic pillars of Kuali Build is that we want a significant amount of reporting to be able to be done from the list view. We want you to be able to choose the columns in the list view, to sort on the columns, to be able to filter on the columns and things like that. So Christine asks, hi, can you ask Kevin to speak to the ability to report on the data in Kuali Build?
Absolutely. So much like what I described earlier, use cases could be as complicated as you allow it to be, right? I'll start from the most basic. Any data you put into Kuali Build will show up as think of it as a tabular view, kind of like what Joel was describing. You can pick your columns, the data will be there. You can do very simple searches, filters, and sorting. That's all built in, right? Now, when does that run out of steam? When you need more data. Especially when you need data to make sense of the submission, both from a workflow perspective as well as from an analysis perspective. Our natural response to that is add more fields. Well, the problem with adding more fields is you now add more burden for the data entry. Yeah. And so that's when the API really started to come in. We can then say, hey, put in the proposal number, hit this button. These 15 fields will now auto-populate from our pre-award system. Right. Now, all that data, because it's in Kuali Build, is now available in the view that Joel was describing earlier, which is great. But then what happens if you want to, let's say, build some more nifty dashboards, right? More visualization. What we have then done is we then say, okay, great. Kuali Build has the ability to export this data into a CSV, or it has the ability for us to API the data out. So let's start with the next simplest, export the data. Export the data, attach it to a Tableau workbook, and now you've got beautiful visuals that you can publish onto Tableau server, except that data isn't updating very frequently. For COVID response, not that big of a deal, right? I just export it once a week. I'm publishing it to the cabinet, no big deal. Now, what happens if you need visualization, you need more data, and you need data that you can't necessarily bring in because there's too much? Now you've got to really talk about a data warehousing solution. And that is where we then take Kuali Build data, API it out, and then stuff it into our data analytics platform in SAP HANA, and then join the data there. And then, of course, those data are then immediately available live in Tableau for us to do visualization. So I think it's sort of a progression. It depends on how complicated your use cases are, how much technical capabilities that you may or may not have. But I think you can get pretty far, in my opinion, having gone through this myself with sort of a fake it till you make it mentality. Obviously, initially, we were exporting CSV files, stuffing it into a Tableau workbook. Eventually, year 2 of the pandemic, we realized this isn't going to go away anytime soon. So then we built those integrations, and then the data became much more automated.
Thank you. Julie Knox just asked for the decision matrix. Kevin, would you be willing to share that with us, and we can share?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send that over to you, Joel, after this, and then you can share it broadly. There's nothing proprietary on there. It's just a simple table that says, these are the different types of things you might care to do. These are the different options that you might have. Okay.
Jenny asks, how much time has this saved you? Just estimate.
Wow. I mean, I would say that I don't have enough programmers to build 419 applications. So it's not even how much time has it saved me. It's almost like what would not have been done, right? So those 419 applications, if you say 10% of them would have been done in the last 3 years since we've launched Build, right? So if I use the pandemic as a starting point, that means over 380 applications or over 350 applications would have never been built, right? So now you take those applications, you bring it back to paper, or you bring it back to whatever tool they had before, which obviously wasn't adequate, which is why they went with Kuali Build in the first place. You're looking at anywhere from, I mean, you look at the documents themselves, right? 66,000 total documents that have been submitted. You can easily quantify just based off of the hours that you would have saved if you were hand processing those documents. And in aggregate, I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands. I mean, I don't know if we're in millions of hours of time saved, but easily in six figures when it comes to hours saved. I know personally that if we were just looking at the COVID situation, I mean, gosh, they were going to hire 3 administrators just to process PDFs and put the data into a shared spreadsheet so they can actually report on it. That's 4 FTEs that we would have had to maintain for 3 years for just that one app, right? And that doesn't include the time savings that come from the workflow that wouldn't have existed if we were to use PDFs. So the savings is astronomical. It would be really difficult to put a number around it. But you know, if I were to look at each of these, even the API endpoint, every API is bringing in at least a dozen data sets, right? A dozen data points. I mean, that data wouldn't be available. So imagine, you know, 66,000 documents where those 81 data points, somebody's hand keying them into the form, right? I mean, that's quite a bit, yeah, would be the answer.
Yeah, a couple hours, at least a couple hours.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the policies, one of our approaches with Kuali Build is the continuous delivery model, where when we fix a bug, we get it out there immediately. When there's an enhancement, when there's a new feature, there's new stuff coming. How has that gone over with your campus, that continuous delivery approach?
So I'll answer a couple different ways. So from my perspective, having been a builder, I would say that the speed in which the enhancements are coming out is awesome. I would not slow down. Thank you, Joel. Don't slow down. Keep it going. When I started using Kuali Build, I mean, it was pretty. It was bare. It was pretty. I would say. I wouldn't call it beta because I mean, obviously we were using it in production, but you know, there were definitely features and functionalities that would have made our lives much easier at administering these forms. Particularly when you know people call in and say, I can't find my form. Can you send me a link, right? Just that alone, I can't tell you how many phone calls and emails I've had to respond to where now they could just click on show me my forms, right? Yeah. So those types of features. So from a continuous delivery perspective, awesome. From a change management perspective, the way that we have been doing it is our staff member, our wonderful 50% right there. He also is our community manager. So he hosts monthly communities of practice with our builders. We have newsletters that he sends out regularly, particularly when there are new features, new gotchas, new lessons learned. We do push those information out. The feedback that we get tends to be mostly positive because there's usually no regression when it comes to new features. They usually add a feature with a feature flag rather than, you know, fundamentally change something. Now, of course, as Joel, you know, we've had a couple of cases where, you know, we used to use data sources one way and then, you know, directory another way, right? So we've had some changes, but, you know, all in all, I would say that, you know, the community is responding very well because they see the benefit to them. It does add, you know, some support burden, you know, and of course, if a form were to break and they don't know how to fix it, we would have to jump in. But we're not seeing that as a reason why we would not want continuous delivery.
Thank you. Okay, Cameron asked, can you talk about rollout? How did you go about training 30 community builders? You've talked a little bit about this, but maybe flesh it out a little bit.
Yeah, I think a faculty member said to me, Kuali Build is the best kept secret. And I was like, what do you mean? Speaking of rollout, right? So I was working with a faculty member. I don't even remember why now. And I had to make a change. And this person basically said, like, you know, how does everybody learn about this, right? So of course, the usual stuff, newsletters, websites, you know, big banners across some of our major web assets. All of that is fine. But really, when it comes down to it, it's about putting the tools in the hands of people and helping them feel like they can actually use it, right? So now, what does that mean? We didn't start with 30 community builders. We started with one, right? And that one happens to be in IT. And then two, you know, our AVC for research happens to be literally the first person outside of ITS that got access. Now, our process has matured quite a bit. What happens now is when someone wants to submit a request and they have never submitted a request for an app before, we put them through a onboarding process. That onboarding process typically involves making sure that they're thinking process oriented, they're thinking process first and not Kuali Build first, right? As much as I like to say, you know, Kuali Build will solve all your problems. If your problem is your process sucks, Kuali Build is not going to solve that problem, right? So we have to make sure that there is this adequate onboarding. After, I think it's like a half an hour onboarding to kind of orient them into what they're trying to accomplish, making sure that Kuali Build is the right solution. We then go through the process with them to understand what is it they're trying to do. And then we then flip around a mostly built out form. How much built out? 70% built out, 80% built out, based off of that initial 30-minute onboarding. Obviously, that's not going to take them all the way to production, but then immediately thereafter, they go in and they start playing with it, right? Because they can make changes themselves. Those changes are then, becomes the hands-on training, essentially, right? So you give them the orientation, you show them what it can do, you give them 80% of their form already built out, and then there's then a back and forth, like consultative. Okay, I'm trying to do this. How do I make this change? And it becomes part of our service offering is to help people overcome their issues. And then eventually they get to a point where they're comfortable hitting the publish button. And we have our next builder added to our mix. Now, we don't do that with everybody now. We got 30 plus people actively building apps, which means a lot of our requests now are not from new builders. They're from existing builders. Well, with existing builders, and we know who they are because they're usually pretty active in our communities of practice, we don't have to put them through onboarding again, right? We just say, okay, what are you trying to do? Okay, is it the right fit? Great, awesome. Check the box. Your app has been provisioned, right? And that's obviously could be very, very fast. Eating our own dog food, our request process is a Kuali Build form. and of course, naturally, those that use Kuali Build and our builders are very capable of navigating that. As far as more generic training, we try not to take that approach. We started doing that early on, where we would take people who were interested because they learned about Kuali Build from their friend, and they want to learn how to use Kuali Build, and they want training, right? We don't do training. If you don't come with a process, we don't want to train you generically, because we know that as soon as we train you and as soon as you get your first process, you're going to come right back and ask for training again. So we don't want to waste that time. We ask people to come with their use cases, come with their processes, even if it's just sketched out, so that we can actually use that for real hands-on training, as opposed to hosting training sessions that people, may or may not show up to, record it, which people may or may not ever watch. We've kind of took a much more pragmatic approach, where at the end of training, you basically have a production application.
So that's very similar to our rollout approach. Our rollout approach has evolved a lot since you rolled out initially. But for those who are interested, that's what we do. So when you come on to Kuali Build, the first thing we do is we sit down in a room with your people who are going to be building their own apps, and we help you build your first app. I loved your quote, Kevin. If you start out with a blank piece of paper, you're going to end up with a blank piece of paper. But our objective is to get you live with something so that you know how to use it. So, and then just a little plug, Terry would beat me up if I didn't plug Kuali Days. So we love for people to come out to Kuali Days in April, I think it is, in Los Angeles, and learn. So we do lots of sort of opportunities for training. There'll be a certification this year that allows people to learn how to build their own apps. Okay, there's a question about mobile and accessibility. So are these things that you need to worry about or be concerned about?
So from a mobile perspective, the application is responsive design. So it does shrink and grow based off of the screen size, right? So naturally, that lends itself very nicely to mobile use cases. Where we've run into issues with mobile has nothing to do with Kuali Build. It has to do with the builder, right? Depending on how you create the app, it could be somewhat burdensome to try and navigate and to utilize within a mobile application or a mobile interface. And so we've not had any sort of technical issues. We've mostly had UX issues where, folks are trying to create something that really is not intended for a mobile audience. Now that is sort of, you cross that bridge once and people tend to understand it. And so
things like putting 5 columns, right next to each other.
Right. Or how like in Kuali Build, there's different sort of frames, like layouts, different tables, and you can kind of restructure things and create pages. Well, some folks, they don't take advantage of some of that functionality. So it could just become a giant form, right? Where you're scrolling forever. Use of conditional fields rather than show all fields, right? Have fields show up as people are filling them out. removing optional fields that just really clog up the UX, are all different ways where you can make the application far more user friendly from a mobile perspective.
Julie asks us, I'm not going to be able to get to all these questions. Julie asks us, early in the conversation, Kevin said that LSS is applied to to improve the business process itself before doing the Kuali Build effort. Is the LSS done by the 30 community builders?
So at UC San Diego, we many years ago, when we got our current CIO, he was a huge kind of TQM sort of champion. Lean Six Sigma was the common vernacular that we chose at San Diego, and then we partnered with our UC San Diego extension as well as our in-house consulting group, operational strategic initiatives, and we actually started launching Lean Six Sigma Yellow Belt training for the entire university. And so from a Lean Six Sigma perspective, we actually have over 8,000 Yellow Belt trained individuals at UC San Diego. So most of our administrators have gone through at least the basic certification for Yellow Belt, which is basically a one-day training. It gives them the tools and the common vernacular. Now, as far as whether or not these processes all go through a Lean Six Sigma analysis, yes, we do encourage and we do offer even green belt scholarships to the campus community when it comes to green belt certification and training, so that way more and more people can have Lean Six Sigma as part of their repertoire. And of course, the onboarding process does involve us beating that into our builders to make sure that they know that before they build the application, they really need to focus on the process. I would say, we probably have 2/3 of our builders that are very process oriented. I would say maybe a quarter of those are even black belt certified Lean Six Sigma experts. And at least half of them are probably green belts. And so, yes, I would say that you really want to try to embed that culture, that process first, if you can. Otherwise, you will inevitably run into a lot of people who will just take their existing processes that are maybe paper or PDF based and just slap Kuali Build on it and call it a day.
And I think, Joel, are you with us? Looks like Joel might have a data connection issue. He's glitching. We're having one of those moments. And I think that's okay. He'll probably jump back in a minute, Kevin. We're actually close to the top of the hour.
Okay.
And I'm not seeing any more questions come in through the Zoom. So I think we might be in a good spot. So it'll be up to me, Kevin, to thank you very much for Joel.
Let me give you a minute for a commercial on process. Tell us about.
Yeah, Joel's glitching a little bit, but I think what he's suggesting, Kevin, since we plugged our Kuali Days webinar, maybe you could take just a minute to plug Process Palooza.
Yes. So you know what? I will absolutely do that. So UC San Diego hosts an annual conference, which is widely attended both by UC San Diego staff members from across the UC system, as well as from other universities. The event is called Process Palooza. We have some web content up now from prior years, and we are now looking at planning and launching Process Palooza 2024, which will be summer of 2024. And Process Palooza, really, the gist of it is it's a celebration of process improvement. And of course, a big part of that is technology, is all the latest craze around AI, as well as tools like Kuali Build. We typically have over 1,000 attendees at our campus, and we would welcome any of you who are in the audience today interested in visiting San Diego during the summer to check out Process Palooza 2024, and more information along with registration details will be made available in the coming months.
Excellent. Yeah, we attend that every year as a sponsor and look forward to joining you again next summer. I'll turn my video on quickly so I'm not just a voice in the sky. This is me, everybody. Hello, Kevin. Thank you so much for this webinar. This was really insightful. I learned a ton. Always do every time we get a chance to speak with you guys down there. Appreciate your time. And for the audience, I just have a couple of slides to close out. So for anyone who is interested in learning more about Kuali Build, we have a ton of information up on our website. I invite you all to grab your phones and go to that QR code. It'll take you to we have a number of videos on YouTube. It'll take you to our Kuali page where you can learn more information. But most importantly, if you have specific questions that you'd like to get follow up on, we have Liz Christensen. She's our Vice President of Sales and Consultation. You might have noticed her at the very beginning of the webinar. She was Zoom bombing in and out. She was my backup moderator for this webinar. So she unintentionally joined, but she's listening in the background. Thank you, Liz, for helping out. And folks, yeah, please be sure to jot down that email address and shoot any questions that you have for Liz in her direction. And with that, we'll close out. Kevin, thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This recording will be made available for those who were not able to attend. And with that, we will close. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Kevin. Bye now.
Bye.